Britain has over 11,000 miles of coastline. And when the tides go out, fascinating remains are revealed of our island's story. Shipwrecks, abandoned villages, forgotten harbours. These are all clues to how people have survived on the coast, how they've learnt to live alongside the sea with all its wonderful resources and its destructive power. Every day on a sandy beach or a rocky foreshore, historical evidence appears and then disappears as the tide rolls in and then rolls back out again. Much of this legacy from the past is under constant threat. From rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and sudden storm surges. We only have a few hours a day to find this intriguing record of our past, so we're making the most of our time to see what we can discover when Britain is at low tide. To shed new light on these coastal gems, I'm joining a team of experts in coastal archaeology. Together, we'll uncover the amazing stories of the intertidal zone.
It's up to us to make sure we don't get drowned.
This week, we're in the southwest, on the Severn Estuary. We'll be investigating what caused a massive explosion on these two barges.
We suddenly hear this great whoomph.
We'll be finding out how an entire medieval village just vanished.
So the churchyard is disappearing into the sea.
It would appear that way.
And what brought Bob Dylan to the River Severn?
That's a very cool picture.
The Severn Estuary is a natural boundary. It not only divides the county of Gloucester, but also England from Wales. It has a tidal range, the difference between high and low tide, of 50 feet, one of the largest in the world. High winds blowing in the opposite direction to the tide can create lethal conditions, especially for small boats and travellers wanting to cross the river. Warning buoys and lights are essential. One of the danger points in this estuary is the bleak island of St Trogs, which is only accessible on a very low tide.
Oh, look at this, team. Another stunning location. Looks very slippery, though.
It does, take care.
I'm visiting the island in the company of my colleagues from CITiZAN, the Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeological Network.
I don't get the impression this is a well-worn route.
I mean, this is clearly all underwater.
Or will become underwater, so we need to have a clear indication of when we're going to get cut off. What we normally do is we find a clear marker, so we keep an eye on that. When we can't see that, it's time to go.
Yeah, and I bet that water rips through here with the tide on the Severn.
And I'm not a very good swimmer.
The main feature of the island is the ruined building on top of it. And beside it, a rather unexpected statue and a very modern solar-powered beacon. So what could this ruin be? And why put a building here, of all places?
Just over here, we've got the river running all the way up to Gloucester, the River Severn. On the other side round here, we've got the River Wye, and that runs all the way up to Chepstow. Perhaps we've got a building, a structure here that's helping to ward people off the really dangerous rocks that you can see we've got in front. The tide has dropped so far. It's exposed these rocks and also the channel that we've come across behind it as well.
We know that the Severn is no joke. It's possibly the most dangerous river in Britain, and the tides whip in here.
They do. I mean, the tidal range is 15 metres in places.
But also, I mean, it's a point which sticks out into the river. I mean, could it have been a point where people crossed? It sticks right out.
Yeah, it may well be that this could have had something to do with people a lot long ago trying to get across the river at this point.
When you look at this, is there anything you can see straight off that, I don't know, sets your mind at rest or raises further questions?
Well, I think it's actually raising more questions, because just from initially looking at the building, it looks like there's loads of different phases to this building. Looking at this section of wall, you've got a very clear distinction going straight up here, where to the right-hand side, you've got what looks like fairly modern rendering then this side here, the rendering between the blocks here has receded much more than here. So it's much more friable, crumbly, see it just kind of breaks off. It's kind of quite lime heavy.
Is that typical of older
Older yes.
mortars?
And then if you come down here, it looks like this is the base of the foundation, but it's not very big.
Can you say anything at all? Can you put a time limit on the age of the structure?
This has definitely got medieval elements, and then there's definitely some much later additions, you know, like modern bits splodged on the end and your kind of later renderings. So I think what we really need is a kind of medieval buildings expert to come in and tell us what's what.
Could that get us any closer to having a sense of what this building was here for?
Well, we do need to demonstrate a relationship between this building and the crossing that it seems to dominate. Its position and the architecture do seem to be related, and we have to find out what that relationship is.
So, we have an intriguing building on an island in the middle of a fast-flowing river. We don't know exactly how old it is. We've no idea what its purpose was or who used it. And, being where it is there a connection with the estuary it overlooks? We'll follow up on this investigation a little later. The Severn Estuary is shaped like a funnel. With this huge tidal range, it could, in the future, become a valuable source of renewable energy. In the past, though, these currents have led to disaster and death. As recently as 1960, 2 barges collided with the Severn Railway Bridge and caused it to partially collapse. The bridge is now gone altogether.
I nearly slipped once and the stick saved me.
Yeah, you're right.
Chris Witts watched it all from the boat he was working on that night, the Wisedale.
We're aiming to get to the 2 wrecks over in the distance there.
These are the remains of the 2 barges. The Archendale on the right, the Wasdale on the left, marooned together for over 50 years. This mud can be treacherous, which is why we've asked local skipper Fred Larkham to guide us across.
It's quite emotional for me being this close up. Yeah, it brings back vivid memories of that night. Yeah, it's quite...
How old were you then?
I was just turned 16. I was a shy lad, and I was working on these tankers with hard crew, 3 hard men on the vessel I worked on, the Wisedale H.
Well, I think I'm going to pop on and see if I can have a look. I'm going to lighten my load a little bit first. I'm going to see what I can see.
Take it easy. Don't go too far on there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, what on earth happened? I mean, how did 2 ships of these kind hit a railway bridge?
We were coming up the Severn, 13 vessels bound for Sharpness out of Avonmouth. And suddenly, the fog rolled in off the banks, filled the river with this thick fog. The Wasdale, he lost his bearings, and he ended up alongside the Archendale, and that's when they became locked together. And unfortunately, they came out into the fast-flowing tide and were taken sideways up the river into the bridge.
As the 2 vessels struck the bridge, 2 huge iron girders broke loose and plunged down onto the barge's decks, causing a massive explosion, which Chris saw from his own boat, the Wisedale.
We suddenly hear this great whoomph and this great orange glow in the distance, and it basically clears the fog.
Seen anything interesting over there, Oliver?
There's lots of interesting things to look at here, Tori. I'm here on the Archendale, which we know had black oil in it, so it was the least flammable of the 2 tankers, if you like. Over here, the Wasdale, it's in a real mess. I mean, you can see where the girder has cut through both of the vessels, and we know that from it dropped from the railway bridge, but that also brought with it the gas main, and it was that gas main combined with the fuels inside these tankers that caused the huge explosion.
George Thompson, who was skipper of the Archendale, he had forgotten to knock the engine out of gear, and the Archendale was going down by the bow, the front end, the stern's coming up, the propeller is thrashing around. One of the men, Jack Cooper, was caught with a propeller, caught his backside, and then he went off, And the river is ablaze because the petrol is spewed out of the washtub and filled the river with this burning petrol. 5 men killed that night.
Gosh. Doesn't really bear thinking about, does it?
No. But it was never really spoken about. It was soon not forgotten, but a subject we didn't talk about much.
While we scramble back to safety, Charlotte is following up on the puzzling story of St Trogs. Now the tide's out again, she's visiting the island with Andrew Reynolds. He's a specialist in medieval archaeology. The next step in our investigation will be to try to work out the age of the ruin and what it was. We've discovered the island has an alternative name, Chapel Island. So does that explain the ruin?
So, here we are. What do you make of this, and what were your initial thoughts?
Well, I mean, clearly you've got 2 surviving elevations of a small masonry building, and to be honest with you, I don't think it would have ever been much larger than the dimensions that you can see here. I mean, if you look at the rock shelf, it's difficult to think of a building protruding any really further than the edge of this shelf.
Let's go and have a look from the exterior, as it were, see if we can find any other clues. OK, so what do you think about in terms of dating the building? We've got some sort of diagnostic features here around the doorway. What do you make of this?
Well, even though it's very weathered, you can see this stone up here as taking us to quite a steeply pitched arch, and we'd place that normally very much in the 13th century, so it's in the Gothic, the early Gothic style.
Great. And just looking at this down here, I noticed stonework going on here with some tool marks.
Well, I think this is a really interesting block of stone, because if you take a closer look at it, and certainly if you catch it in the right light, you can see a series of tool marks.
Yep.
So you can imagine it forming a structural element like this, with a column underneath it. So whether that was the original place for it, I don't think it was, because on this side of the building, you can see that it's actually just a plain chamfered mould all the way around the opening. So this comes from somewhere else in the building.
Well, it's funny you should say that, actually, because there's a whole load of worked stones strewn all over the place. So follow me this way. This one's particularly interesting.
This is...
Take a look at this.
This is a very fine piece of moulded stone, part of a late medieval doorway. The surface has been really finely worked, and you can see this moulding here. And this is a stone that you would find at the sort of the foot of a doorway.
Right.
So you can imagine the door swings around and shuts against that face there. Yeah. So I think what we have here is really clear evidence that there's a second entrance into the building.
Right. Yeah.
Most religious buildings have a north entrance and a south.
Yeah.
So
That's...
it looks like a small chapel.
OK. Well, that's great.
So, Andrew believes that the building was a chapel and that the ruins are 13th century. But why put a chapel somewhere so inaccessible? Are there historical documents that can tell us more?
The problem of crossing this volatile estuary has challenged the people living on its riverbanks for centuries. But rather than creating a barrier between communities, it's often meant that people have more in common with their counterparts on the opposite bank than they do in towns and villages inland. It's about communication and trade across the estuary and how to overcome those dangerous tides.
The oldest crossing point of the estuary we know about is very near St Trogs. Today it's marked by a slipway at Beachley, and on the other side at Orst, this now decaying ramp where ferry passengers used to disembark. The Romans used this crossing point to ferry soldiers into South Wales. There are records of it in the Middle Ages, when the Old Passage, as it was known, operated a regular ferry service. And by the 1800s, mail coaches were crossing the estuary 6 times a day. When the Severn Railway Tunnel opened in 1886, the ferry seemed doomed. But in the 1920s, it reopened, this time to cars.
The This is what's left of the last ferry station at Ost. It closed in 1966 when the road bridge over there opened. The cars used to come down here along this ramp and they'd board the ferry at the end. Not that you can see much of it because it's currently disappearing right into the mud.
The jetty is destroyed a bit more with every tide, and it won't be long before all physical evidence of this ferry point has gone. Which is why it's great that local ferry enthusiast Tim Ryan can bring it to life with personal memories and wonderful photographs. He's even planning to restore the Severn Princess, one of the old ferry boats his father used to help maintain.
That used to be a cafe.
As a boy, Tim's best friend was the grandson of Enoch Williams, the man who reinvented the Aust Beachley ferry and turned a 5-hour journey around the estuary by road into a 15-minute boat ride.
Was it a hit immediately?
An immediate hit. He had a boat called The Princess Ida. She carried about 8 cars, but the traffic on the road was growing quite rapidly then. She was too small. So in 1935, he built the Severn Queen and the Severn King.
How many cars were sitting on the ferry at that point once they had the Severn Queen and King?
The Severn Queen and the Severn King took about 16 cars. You can see when they're just loading. There are 16 vehicles on that ferry, that's the Severn Queen, and they got them on there with a turntable. So the car came onto the turntable and they pulled it around with a rope. To get 16 cars on there, they had to park them all so close together you couldn't open the doors. Can you imagine, Tori, saying a ferry boat on the most dangerous river in Britain today, full of cars, full of people who couldn't get out?
I mean, were there any accidents?
There were a couple, nothing serious. There were a couple of men overboard, and they were always coinciding with races at Chepstow.
All right, OK.
So put 2 and 2 together.
Yes.
Yeah. People don't remember how important these ferries were. In the last full year of service, 1965, the 3 boats, the Queen, the King and the Princess, carried over 500,000 cars.
That's a period of huge change, isn't it? From the late 1920s right into the, the mid-1960s.
And again, I love being involved in this because it tells about a different way of life, an evolving way of life from the 20s right through, as you rightly say, to the 60s. And some of the characters who use the ferries, well, you know what we're coming to, don't you?
That's a very cool picture.
That's His Royal Bobness, Mr. Bob Dylan, buying his ticket to get onto the ferry at Ost.
Yeah.
He'd played the Coastline Hall the night before. He played acoustic in the first half, protest songs, folky songs, and in the second half he came on with the band and they ripped into like a Rolling Stone electric and they booed him off stage. So he's so, say, looking enigmatic in that photograph.
Yeah, he's actually looking
not.
pretty grumpy.
He's pretty grumpy, but that's Dylan's favourite photograph of himself.
Everybody who's travelled from England to Wales between the period of 1926 and 1966 probably came up this route.
Yeah, it's a real piece of history.
Yeah, it really is.
Of its time.
It really is.
Yeah.
The jetties at Aust and Beachley are being destroyed day by day. The chapel on St Trogs could be facing the same fate, so archaeologists are keen to find out as much as they can. To widen our investigation, Charlotte is visiting the archives in Hereford.
Nice to meet you.
She's gone there to meet Maddie Gray, whose research into the records of medieval bishops has given her new insights into our chapel.
I think what we've probably got is an island hermitage. If you were a hermit in the early Christian tradition, you went out into the desert. Mm-hmm. You've a job to find a desert in Wales. So they had this idea of the desert in the ocean.
I like that. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah.
It first crops up in 1290. Mm-hmm. And what we've got here is quite interesting, actually, because, you see, you've got the bishop appointing a man called John Sturr, who is a monk. He's a Benedictine.
Benedictine monk.
And he's being given the right to say services in the island chapel.
Ah,
now,
that's interesting.
He shouldn't be doing this, you see.
Oh, right, now, explain. Why should he not be doing
it? A Benedictine monk was not supposed to go wandering around.
Right.
He was supposed to stay in his monastery. They said a monk out of his cloister is like a fish out of water.
Oh, so he was a renegade monk?
I think he might have been a senior monk If you were a senior monk, you had a big administrative job.
Yeah.
You might have wanted to spend a bit of time in prayer and reflection.
Okay.
So you retreated to your island,
Right.
either permanently or maybe just for a while. It seems to become a very popular destination for pilgrims, probably at its most popular in the 14th century, and it's become quite prosperous and quite profitable.
So where were the profits coming from?
The only thing they could have been coming from is the offerings of pilgrims.
Oh, so the pilgrims' offerings.
Pilgrims coming to the island, asking for a safe crossing or giving thanks for a safe crossing, giving money. And the island chapel of St Turlog was valued at £10 a year.
So that's an
Which is
awful lot.
A lot. I mean, you could live quite comfortably on £5 a year.
Wow.
So you know, we're talking really serious money. We're moving on to 1416. You start to get the feeling that things are going downhill a little bit.
Ah, OK.
You've got the bishop, and he's had a querella, a complaint, from the vicar of Tidnam. What the vicar says is that he should be receiving 40 shillings, £2 a year from the profits of the island. And he's not been getting it.
Right.
So is it that the money just isn't there?
And what do you think the reason for this could be?
It could have been a decrease in pilgrimage to the island. It could be rising sea levels. Rising sea levels would mean it was more difficult to get to the island.
Yeah.
So gradually it just, you get the feeling it's starting to fizzle out.
Yeah.
The Hereford records then confirm that the chapel dates from the 13th century, and also that different kinds of religious recluses, monks and possibly hermits, were visiting the island throughout the 1300s. So, what else was happening here in that period? Like St Turog's, the estuary banks over the years have taken a real beating from the tides. Erosion is widespread. Gustav and I are off downriver to Sudbrook, a modern village that may be under threat. Its medieval predecessor certainly was. We've been joined by Alex Belisario, one of Gus's colleagues from CITiZAN.
No.
So,
well, what was it? Well, this was a church dedicated to the Holy Trinity. We can't see too much of it anymore.
You can say that again?
Yes. I wouldn't like to stand underneath that bell tower anymore. What can you say about it? I mean, do you know how old it was? Well, what we can see at the moment is 14th century, but we know that the original church was 12th century. So it seemed to have got expanded in the 14th century.
So that suggests a prosperous parish population in the 12th century, which maybe doubles in size in the 14th and by the 15th century, suggesting that this was a very prosperous community, presumably with a very large village.
If that is the case, I mean, where is it? Where's the village? Well, that's the conundrum, isn't it? It's not here. So, if you look in the field over there, during the 1930s and the 1970s, they did excavations which identified a two-roomed medieval building. It had 12th and 13th century pottery in it, which ties up nicely with the church.
Yeah, so that's one building anyway, but that's not an entire community. Where's the rest of it?
Look behind you.
No, don't. Steady.
So we've got this
enormous cliff.
There's an enormous cliff.
Enormous cliff.
We don't know too much, but what we do know is in the 1870s, there was a report of human remains and coffins being found on the foreshore.
Well, just in front of where the chapel was.
Just in front of where the chapel was.
So the churchyard is disappearing into the sea.
It would appear that way, but I think it's still a bit of a mystery, isn't it?
So the remains of the medieval church tell us there must have once been a village. We know that erosion was destroying the churchyard in the 19th century. But is that when the people left? More to investigate. Meanwhile, at our other medieval site, St Turog's, we now know quite a lot about the chapel, but not much about its relationship with the estuary. And given the position of St Turog's in the estuary, we're wondering whether the medieval chapel was there to help local shipping. We're hoping that an aerial survey will provide essential clues.
So, Peter, shall we get this up in the air?
OK, taking off.
Fantastic. I love these things.
Once in the air, the cameras on Pete's drone will take hundreds of still photos, each from a different angle, picking up the visual information he needs to make an accurate model of the island.
I've uploaded the flight plan, so it's now under automatic control, and you'll see it zipping off to its first point.
So, Andrew, what is it that you think this survey can help us to understand more about St Trogs?
Well, I think one of the first things it'll give us an indication of is the potential form of the original building, because you can see that there's quite really varied topography on the island itself. So we can understand the nature of this shelf that the chapel sits on in a bit more detail. So again, that's the importance of mapping all of this topography in detail, put the pieces together and then work out the bigger picture.
We could be on our way to seeing a reconstruction of St Trogs as it was in the Middle Ages, and that might well reveal some surprising features of the building. I've travelled a few miles to Ebbw Vale on the edge of the Brecon Beacons. It's home to Gwent Archives, where I hope to find out more about Subbrook, the village that vanished from the estuary. I've joined Virginia Bainbridge, who specialises in handwritten historical documents, the kind I need help with.
Virginia, what can all this stuff tell us about life in Subbrook?
Well, this is an original document from 1584, a property transfer, and it's between Edmund Morgan, and he's selling a little farm to somebody called John Roberts. He's got quite a substantial farm. He's perhaps the sort of person who'd have a rather shiny four-wheel drive vehicle and all the trappings to match in our own society.
These documents confirm that up to the 1500s, Subbrook thrived. So when did the village disappear and its church collapse?
Which is land in the common fields, pasture rights, etc.
Interestingly, by the late 1600s, Subbrook Church has become part of the nearby parish of Portskewett.
We have here the parish registers for Portskewett.
But people are still using Subbrook Church.
They are still using Subbrook Church. We've got 1674, William Blethyn of Durham married Mrs. Temperance Rumsey of Sudbrook at the Church of Sudbrook on the 14th of September, 1674.
1670s, it seems to be that Subbrook is still active as a church, even though it's in these Portskewett registers.
Yes.
And then what happens?
Well, we move over to this, which is the second of the parish registers, and we find that we've got quite a few people who are of Sudbrook, but they are being buried at Portskewett.
I can see Sudbrooks there. So they stopped using the church for their marriages and deaths.
What's really interesting about this change is that Virginia has found independent evidence of what might have caused it. In a late edition of William Camden's Britannia, published in 1695, there's an entry about Portskewett, followed by a fascinating footnote.
And then it's got, adjoining to it is Subbrook, the church whereof, called Trinity Chapel, standeth so near the sea that the vicinity of so tyrannous a neighbour has spoiled it of half the churchyard. Well, that tells us the churchyard's half gone, but it doesn't say actually much about the church itself. So, I mean, do we know what happened to the church?
Well, if you could pull that next document towards us, Tori, then this is the sale of the manor of Sudbrook and the parish church of Sudbrook aforesaid.
Next few words, now fallen down.
And all. So the church has gone.
The church has gone by 1720. And that's really interesting because I know that between 1690 and 1720, Britain was hit by a severe number of winter storms. Those storms might have been responsible first for the churchyard crumbling into the Severn and then maybe finally for the church itself entering this decrepit state. You can see that very quickly, maybe in 30 years, it could easily become a ruin, and that's it. Subbrook is gone.
Really fascinating evidence. The villagers from medieval Subbrook moved to other parts of the local area, probably in the late 1600s. And by the early 18th century, the village sadly has died. exploring this tricky, powerful estuary, I'm more and more conscious of the difficulties the people on this coastline have faced as they've tried to go about their daily lives. Navigating the river was unavoidable for anyone wanting to trade. The need for a new way to cross the estuary was obvious.
Well, this looks like a bit of a challenge to get to.
Now the tide's out, Oliver's investigating an early, though unsuccessful attempt, back in 1810. He's met up with retired engineer Keith Walker, who's made a study of the efforts of one man to connect the two sides of the estuary.
Line of masonry, and I think that's my CITiZAN colleague over there having a look at it, Keith.
The intention in 1810 was to create the world's first underwater, or subaqueous, tunnel. This shaft is all that remains of it. Some of Oliver's colleagues from CITiZAN have got together with local volunteers to try to understand the shape of the structure.
So it looks like actually instead of it being a circle, it's more of an oval. And you can sort of see it coming around through here. This side's already fallen down towards downstream, but we actually got a crack coming through here as this tree is growing through it. But at least the tree is still just holding it together. You can see some almost daylight through it, so I think that's really rather vulnerable now.
The groundbreaking idea was to tunnel under the estuary from Newnham to Arlingham, a distance of over 400 metres. The aim was to transport coal from the Forest of Dean to towns across the estuary and beyond.
So, Keith, obviously we've got remains on this side, but we don't have any on the other bank, so there was a problem somewhere.
Unfortunately, we don't have anything on the other bank because the chaps by 1812 had managed to drive the tunnel halfway under the river here, 223 yards. And then at 4 in the morning, when the miners are working away on the tunnel down there, there was an inrush of water, and they apparently just made it out in time.
This is the archaeologist's 3D model of the ruined shaft. In its day, the job of the shaft was to pump water from the tunnel. That night, it was overwhelmed.
It's a real shame that this project didn't work out because it would have been the first subaqueous tunnel. Do we know anything about the engineer who was tasked with what is essentially, a really pioneering project?
Yeah, we know Robert Tipping was the engineer for the tunnel. It's intriguing to think if you got all the way across, you can bet your bottom dollar he would have been in demand all over the place to repeat what he'd done.
He'd have been a real pioneer of the age.
Indeed.
But the story of the Severn Tunnel didn't stop there. We'll return to this story later. The island of St Trogs has always been a landmark of the Severn Estuary. Today, it has a beacon to warn off passing boats. But what about back in the Middle Ages?
Our investigations into St Trogs has confirmed that monks or hermits were visiting, possibly even living on the island. And they were being paid for their services, and that probably meant offering prayers for safe passage across the river. But is there any evidence they were actively warning passing ships of the dangers?
The island's history is complicated by the variety of names it's had. As well as St Trogs and Chapel Island, it's been known as St Tecla's. I've come to Gloucester Archives to meet Mary Hughes-Edwards, who's done research into hermits and anchorites and locations like our puzzling island.
Mary, we have learned quite a lot about St Trogs. I mean, I'm looking at this wonderful map here, 1610 John Speed map, which...
I hardly believe it.
And you see, down here, you can see this thing called the Treacle. That's the location where we've been looking at this ruined chapel of St Trogs. Now, I think Treacle is supposed to be a corruption of Tekla, and we have a reference in the late 1400s to this chapel here being called St Tekla the Anchorite. I mean, what is the difference between an anchorite and a hermit?
A hermit is someone who can exchange their location, in theory, at will. Although as the Middle Ages wore on, they had to get more and more kind of permission, hermit permits, if you like. But an anchorite would be a man or a woman who is vowed to fixity of place.
Anchored.
Anchor, I guess, yes. And some of the texts that were written to help them like to play with the metaphor of the anchor. But actually, anchorite comes from the Greek anakoretes, which means to withdraw.
Were they a common feature of the Middle Ages?
Yes, they were. We don't have evidence yet for one in every single town or village, but we do have evidence for one in most. But quite often, they lived in threshold spaces, crossings, bridges, estuaries, and maintained beacons, as possibly here was the case.
It wouldn't be unreasonable to suggest that there could have been a dual role then for St Trox.
Absolutely, yeah. That a recluse, whether a hermit or an anchorite, was looking after the beacon or looking after the crossing, and also devoting themselves to a life of contemplation, and yet also one of action, and not to see those two things as mutually exclusive.
When did that service end? I mean, what happened after? I mean, we stopped seeing hermits, really, don't we?
Well, in essence, at the Reformation, when nuns and monks and hermits and anchorites are kind of turfed out by Henry VIII's forces, some forms of religious life return, like nuns and monks, and some don't.
So if all of these anchorites and hermits have effectively disappeared from the landscape of the British Isles, from this part of the world by the end of the Reformation, I mean, who is looking after the mariners? Who's taking up that job of tending beacons?
Well, there is a tradition from the early 1500s of the Fraternity of the Blessed Trinity. They took over looking after the beacons, and we know of various buildings that were dedicated to that particular confraternity. So I think some of the beacons were all right.
The Guild Fraternity of the Most Glorious and Undivided Trinity, we know better today as Trinity House, the 500-year-old organisation dedicated to maritime safety. The answer to the dangers of this estuary was to build a bridge, or indeed a tunnel. This tunnel succeeded where previous attempts had failed, and it also helped to revive the fortunes of our lost village. The records showed us that Sudbrook died in the early 1700s, but then miraculously, in the Victorian era, it's resurrected.
And this is it, a single row of 19th and 20th century houses. There aren't any shops that I can see, or any pubs. It makes you wonder why it was ever rebuilt.
Few people know more about Sudbrook than retired history teacher Pete Strong. The new village, he says, came about when the Severn Railway Tunnel was being dug beneath the estuary.
The tunnel itself is some distance below our feet. The railway line that we're standing on was built to bring in the coal trains that fueled the pumping station, which was run by steam engines, and that was for pumping the water out of the tunnel. Every tunnel needs water pumped out of it, and the original plan was to have a pumping capacity of something like 250,000 gallons a day, which they thought would be more than enough. But in 1879, when they thought they were close to finishing the project, because they were only 130 yards from meeting in the middle, they hit a massive underground freshwater spring, which immediately started to discharge up to 15 million gallons of water a day into the tunnel. Luckily, there was a change of shift at that time, so hardly anybody was down the tunnel. Financially, it was terrifying for the Great Western Railway. It looked like they would have to abandon the whole thing. And so they decided now to contract it out to a very experienced railway contractor by the name of Thomas Andrew Walker. You know, normally on this sort of project, you'd have wooden huts occupied almost entirely by male navvies, with all the problems that would lead to, with hard-working, hard-drinking, hard-fighting men. Walker, he had a different view. His idea, as you see, was to build much more permanent settlement where workers could live with their families. You'd end up with a much more disciplined workforce, avoiding the worst of the problems of drink and fighting and so on.
I can see why there's no pub then.
Well, that's right. I mean, Walker was very much against the demon drink. He was a very religious man. In fact, one of the first buildings he built in this village was a mission hall,
Wow.
So it wasn't just houses that he built, it was a whole community. And what we have here, for example, as an alternative to the pubs, was the coffee room and reading room. It wasn't entirely successful. So they did have their moments. There was drunkenness, there was fighting, but it was nothing like the level that you had from the South Wales Railway navies back in the 1840s.
How did he get the job done? How did he finish it? Get rid of all that water?
In 1885, it looked like the project was virtually finished. All the brickwork had been done, the Great Spring had been diverted, but the pressure of the water was building up between the bricks and the rock face, and it was popping the bricks into the tunnel. And his solution was to build the permanent pump house, which we have now. And that was to have massive amounts of steam power to keep the tunnel dry.
Tunnel's dry. When did it open?
Well, after 14 years of hard work, it opened to goods traffic on the 1st of September 1886, and then to regular passenger service on the 1st of December 1886. And for 100 years, it was the longest railway tunnel in the world.
Well done, Walker. I mean, what a feat of engineering.
Absolutely, absolutely. Brilliant piece of work.
Sudbrook has had an extraordinary life. There was an Iron Age settlement here over 2,000 years ago. We now understand its medieval history and how the village declined. And then it had a wonderful new life in the 19th century. A whole new village sprang up and achieved one of the great feats of engineering of the Victorian age. Now there's just one last bit of research to do to complete our investigation of that chapel on St Trogs.
What have you been up to then, Peter?
Pete Rokeslow has used all the photographs he took with his drone camera to create a scaled model of the site.
The first thing we did was a height model, which really bring out how much relief we're talking about.
So the hotter the colours, the higher the land.
Exactly, yeah.
Just to get my eye in, is this where we came in? Across there?
We came down this gully here, and then across here, and then we climbed up sort of through this way. I think if we look at the model in 3 dimensions, that's very instructive.
Wow, yes.
And it's worth noting, I mean, this is just a natural process, of course, that all the debris is spread over on that side of it.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that really clearly. But we know from being there, these are big chunks of stone.
Well, we did actually find a door jamb, which had kind of been washed up to the east. It definitely didn't come from the existing doorway. We know that because it wasn't missing a piece of stone.
Oh, I
that.
see.
It was completely...
So we have 2 doors.
Yeah. And if it was a chapel, it would make sense you would have a door in the north and you would have a door in the south.
Is there anything we can say about what the chapel would have looked like in its life, in its heyday?
If you look at most medieval chapels, they tend to be, the small ones tend to be 2 squares, so 2 equal squares. And if you were to extend that line along there, you would have the footprint of a typical 13th century chapel. What that means is we've lost a third of the chapel, which is a great shame. So there must have been violent erosion on that supposedly sheltered side.
Do you get any sense of that from your drone survey? Can you say anything about the sort of the general setting?
Yes, you have the contour lines do follow it very nicely where it could be.
That's the edge. Yeah, that's the sense of what you would expect there in the Middle Ages.
On that rock, bedrock, and it fits quite nicely, doesn't it?
So, Pete's aerial survey has revealed some fascinating new insights. It's now clear that the chapel, in its heyday in the 1300s, would have been larger, dominating not only the headland, but the estuary it overlooked and the shipping whose safety it tried to protect. The communities on either side of this river have always been eager to communicate and trade with each other. But they have to struggle with the dangers and uncertainties of the immense tides. Human imagination, clever engineering. These have gradually brought the 2 banks of the estuary, England and Wales, closer together. And as cars and vans cross the Severn Bridge today, they scarcely realise what a mighty barrier they are so effortlessly passing over.